Bibliophiles of the internet, today I'm here to recommend some dark, creepy, possibly scary queer books. With the fall season incoming, at least here in the Northern Hemisphere, which is traditionally a season of death or barrenness, especially in the natural world, my mind gravitates towards dark, creepy horror books, which I think are perfect for the season. Reading and watching horror is a relatively new development for me in my personal timeline. It's not something I used to be into, but now I love, but I'm very intentional with the kinds of horror I consume, which has led me to discover a lot of really exciting things, specifically in the queer horror space. These, to the best of my knowledge, bearing in mind that I am a deeply imperfect human who makes mistakes and oversights, are all of the queer horror or spooky books that I have ever read since I started tracking what I read, and I have them organized from oldest to most recent reads. Originally, I wanted to make one video where I had all the queer horror books I've read, all the ones that are on my radar, and all the ones coming out in the future that I'm interested in, but after I actually wrote out all of those, I was like, this is way too much. So if you'd like to see at least a second part, let me know in the comments. The other disclaimer I wanted to make is that the term horror is being used fairly loosely here in some cases for the sake of inclusivity, but I tried really hard to stick to the spirit of the genre, so even if some of these are less scary than others, they all contend with elements of death, loss, fear, and darkness to some extent. I have a lot of things to talk about here, and I'm gonna try to keep things moving at a good pace, so let's just get started with Her Body and Other Parties by Carmen Maria Machado. This is a short story collection where all of the stories explore the different kinds of violence that are inflicted upon or forced upon women's bodies, but by using horror, fantasy, and speculative elements. That's actually all I have to say about this. It's a captivating, memorable, deeply unsettling collection of stories. I can't remember the ratio of how many are queer, but regardless, Carmen Maria Machado is a queer author who explores queerness in her work, and I highly recommend this. And also, even though it's nonfiction, her memoir In the Dream House might also qualify as horror in some ways if you think about it. Moving right along to a book that won't surprise a single person. Say it with me. It's Cemetery Boys by Aiden Thomas. Again, would I classify this as horror specifically? No, but it has those paranormal elements. It's a murder mystery, it's about death and summoning the dead, spirit magic, all those things. If you don't know, this story is following a young Mexican-American transgender boy named Yadriel who wants to prove to his family that he can and does have brujo powers. His family is very traditional. They believe that women and men are born with very distinct bruja or brujo powers, and that you can't change the magic you're born with, so they won't allow him to unlock his power in his quinces. So Yadriel decides to take matters into his own hands and perform his own ceremony in secret, and when he tries to summon the spirit of his late cousin, he accidentally summons the school bad boy, Julian Diaz. I'm not going to go on and on about this. Y'all know how I feel about it. It's an incredibly important book to me and one of my absolute favorites. If for some godforsaken reason you haven't read this one yet, you should definitely fix that. Next we have The Route of Ice and Salt by Jose Luis Zarate, which was originally written in Spanish. This is a horror novella reimagining Dracula's final voyage, I believe, to England. It's set upon a ship known as the Demeter, which is making a routine cargo trip. As they make this voyage, the captain keeps getting the sense that something is not right. He's having strange nightmares, the crew seems to be picking up on unsettling omens, and he becomes convinced that something is stalking the ship at night. This is a weird little cult classic. It has all of those familiar horror beats that you would expect from any creature feature, but the writing is also lush and ornate and strangely provocative. There's a layer of heavy sensuality that pierces through the entire thing, especially as the captain is grappling with his own queer desires. It's a hard book to pitch because it's not going to be for everyone. The characters are deeply unlikable and in some ways immoral, but the story is also a really powerful exploration of the perceived connections between monstrosity and queerness. I've said this before, but it's less human versus monster and more monster versus monster, and I think it's a fascinating, if not strange, little book. Then we have The Taking of Jake Livingston by Ryan Douglas. This is a YA horror book about Jake Livingston, a young queer black boy who goes to this prep school where he's one of the only black kids. As if that's not enough to stand out, Jake can also see the dead, most of whom are relatively harmless, just reliving their own deaths and rarely interacting with living folks. But then Jake meets Sawyer, a troubled teen who committed homicide before taking his own life, who's turned into a powerful, vengeful ghost, and whose plans for conquering the afterlife might just include Jake himself. In full transparency, this is not one of my favorite books, but it could very well become someone else's, and it's doing a lot of really interesting things, so I think it's worth mentioning. This is an exceptionally dark story, especially considering that it's YA, and it has that unsettling possession storyline that takes on new meaning when you consider the power dynamics of the characters involved. And related to that, the story also explores how Black communities are not allowed the luxury of healing from their traumas, either collectively or as individuals. So there's a lot of great thematic work going on here. There's a grotesque, horrific, gritty atmosphere that permeates the entire story, so if it sounds interesting to you, I think it's definitely worth checking out. Next, I want to talk about Summer Suns by Lee Mandello. I remember when this was first released, it was pitched as like Fast and Furious meets sticky Southern Gothic, and in the spirit of that, I would also say that this book is almost like if the titular boys of the Raven Boys were written for an adult audience. This is a Southern Gothic, borderline dark academia story about Andrew, who's getting ready to start a new graduate program and move in with his best friend / unrequited lover, Eddie, but then he learns that Eddie has died by what appears to be suicide. From there, Andrew reluctantly inherits Eddie's roommates and friends and unfinished research, I believe, along with Eddie's ghost, who is haunting Andrew and begging for revenge. I love this book. I've always said that it's an intense treatise on toxic masculinity, its inherent relationship with whiteness, and how that toxicity can manifest within queer white men in very specific ways. It's very much a story about violence and anger and grief, and about how the characters exchange all of those things for power. It's about the lengths they're willing to go in order to try and outrun their feelings, their complicity, their perceived weaknesses, no matter how fruitless those attempts may be. So many parts of this story are stuck in my brain for good. I think more people definitely need to read this. Next, I want to talk about perhaps another unexpected pick, and that is The City Beautiful by Aiden Polidorous. This is another title that I personally wouldn't classify as horror first, but it has so much of those dark, supernatural elements that I think it holds its own with the rest of these. This is a dark historical murder mystery and possession story set in Chicago during 1893. We're following Alter, a young Romanian and Jewish immigrant who's working in America so he can help the rest of his family immigrate. When his best friend and secret love, Yakov, becomes the latest victim in a long line of murdered Jewish boys, Alter finds himself living in a nightmare. Not only has he lost his best friend, but now he's possessed by Yakov's Dybbuk, plunging him into a world of corruption and deceit and darkness, and now he must find Yakov's killer before the killer claims him next. This is a fantastic queer historical fantasy. It's definitely dark and grim. It has that horror edge to it with these elements of the undead, bodily possession, losing control of body autonomy, etc. It's also set against the backdrop of the Chicago World Fair, which makes everything that much more interesting and intense. This is definitely an underrated, underread story. Again, even though it's kind of stretching the original prompt, if sharing about it puts the story on even one more person's radar, then I will take that chance. Then we have Sorrowland by River Solomon. This is another queer Southern Gothic mixed with speculative fiction about Vern, who escapes the oppressive religious compound where she was born and raised at 7 months pregnant. She runs to the woods where she gives birth to her twins alone and plans to raise them far away from the reach of the outside world. Even in the forest, Vern is being hunted by this compound, and in her desperation to evade them, she discovers that her body is being racked by these horrific and inexplicable changes. This is another one of my favorite books. It is absolutely incredible and unforgettable, especially in the ways it explores long-lasting intercommunity violence, generational trauma, and how it uses the lens of body horror to deconstruct and challenge the strong Black woman complex. This metamorphosis that Vern is experiencing is, in theory, supposed to make her stronger, but in all actuality, that change and that power is highly unsustainable and makes her much more vulnerable than you would expect. It's about being haunted by the past, living with the consequences of violence, and finding new ways to exist. Again, I think so many more people need to read this. Then, of course, there's Hell Followed With Us by Andrew Joseph White. This is a gruesome YA horror story set in a post-apocalyptic world where a trans boy named Benji has just escaped from the extremist cult that raised him, a religious cult that's actually responsible for the destruction of the world. Not only was this cult planning the mass genocide of all quote-unquote non-believers, but they've also infected Benji with a bioweapon that can transform him into a powerful monster known as a seraph. So as he's secretly undergoing this transformation, he's taken in by a group of local teens from an LGBTQ center who absolutely cannot find out that they're harboring a monster powerful enough to eliminate the rest of humanity for good. This is another book I've talked about and recommended a million times. It's brutal, it's violent, it's disturbing in so many ways, but it's also deeply empowering and cathartic. It's about embracing monstrosity when that's the role you've always been cast in. It's about fighting to survive even the most horrific of circumstances, and it's about finding hope in a brutal and unforgiving world. Moving right along to another book I've talked about many times, so I'll try to keep it brief, but that is Exodus 23 by Freydis Moon. This is a dark monster romance novella. It's an exploration of religious eroticism and queer emancipation, and it's about a Mexican-American trans man named Diego who's basically starting over by taking a job in New Mexico where he's helping to rebuild a rundown church. This church is abandoned. It's in this middle of nowhere town, so it's basically just Diego and the handsome caretaker, Ariel. And as the two of them rebuild this church and get to know each other, Diego begins to see past Ariel's human disguise and realizes that he might just be falling for one of God's original creations. Again, I've talked about this a million times, so I don't want to take up too much space here. To say that this is one of my favorite stories is an understatement. It is absolutely fantastic. It's a story that explores transness as divinity, that once again looks at embracing monstrosity, but in a very literal sense. It's about witnessing terrible power and still finding beauty through that experience. The story also parallels the journey of transition with the experience of faith, which I thought was brilliant. Again, I've said it so many times, but I definitely recommend this. From the same author, we also have With a Vengeance. I also mentioned this one recently, so I'll keep it brief, but it's about a non-binary Latina character named Kai whose estranged mother has recently passed away, which forces them to return to their hometown so they can go through all of her things. Kai struggles with their mental health in the best of times, and going back to this place of trauma only further aggravates all of their worst trauma responses, which results in Kai hearing voices. One day they come face to face with the voice living in their head, Eli, who turns out to be a powerful demon duke, and one who offers Kai all the pain, pleasure, and power they can handle if they allow themselves to be possessed. As I always say, this story is really about liberation in so many different ways, and most importantly, I think it's exploring how hard-won liberation can be and how Kai is excavating that power and that freedom from tremendously traumatizing and violent circumstances. Both Kai and Eli are deeply messed up characters, but that's also what makes them so compelling and what makes the story so satisfying when they're being positioned as equals. It's a wild ride for sure, but I enjoyed it. Then there's What Moves the Dead by T. Kingfisher. This is a gothic horror novella that's retelling the fall of the House of Usher, and we're following a retired trans soldier named Alex Easton who receives word that Ka's childhood friend Madeline Usher is dying, so Alex races to the Ushers' remote estate. What Ka finds there is a clearly crumbling estate taken over by fungal growth and possessed wildlife, and Alex learns that not only is Madeline sleepwalking and speaking in strange voices, but the mysterious lake on the grounds is also inexplicably glowing at night. This was my first ever introduction to T. Kingfisher, and I think it's a great entry point. It perfectly showcases what she does best, which is writing these perfectly concise but also perfectly detailed stories that brilliantly marry elements of horror with levity in the most unexpected moments. That said, this novella definitely leans more on the creepy side. It's unsettling, it keeps you guessing, and even though it stays true to the tone and the major beats of the source material, it takes the story to new heights in a way that I don't think Edgar Allan Poe could have ever imagined in his wildest dreams. Then we have The Honeys by Ryan LaSala. This is a sun-drenched, summery horror story about a genderqueer main character named Mars, whose twin sister dies under horrific and bizarre circumstances. Mars is convinced that it all leads back to this prestigious summer camp that he and his sister used to attend together, so Mars decides that he's going to go back to Aspen this year in Caroline's place. There he's trying to connect with Caroline's friends, a group of glamorous girls known as the Honeys, who are beautiful and terrifying and most certainly trying to hide something. This book is wild and I loved it. The experience of reading it definitely feels like a gradual surrendering of your sanity as it delves into these truly horrific reveals. It's sinister and strange and utterly unforgettable in my opinion. At its core, I think this story is really about performance, this instinct we have to bury our true selves and our true feelings so we can make ourselves palatable for other people. It's about how performance can be a weakness, but it can also be a strength or something that protects us. This is a horror story story that I could not turn away from. There are scenes from this story that I cannot forget, even if I wanted to. And because of how incredible this story is, I really don't. Switching things up, we have a graphic novel called Over My Dead Body by Sweeney Boo. It's a creepy, witchy graphic novel about Abby, who attends this Institute of Magic hidden in the woods. And as the school is preparing for Samhain, when the veil between life and death is thinnest, Abby's closest friend goes missing in the Forbidden Forest. Everyone tells Abby just to let the Coven investigate this disappearance, but she's hesitant to trust them because there was a similar disappearance in the past where that young foundling never came back. So Abby and her friends decide to dabble in some forbidden magic in order to find out the truth, and in doing so discover that there may be more connections between these disappearances than they originally thought. I think this is a great fall read if you're looking for something quick and creepy to read. The story is dark, it has this compelling mystery at the center, and from a design standpoint, the use of color is also extremely effective in conveying the dark, magical atmosphere of the story. Overall, it's a spooky, lighthearted, witchy mystery that I think fits the bill for this prompt. Then we're switching it up again with some nonfiction. I am, of course, talking about It Came From the Closet, edited by Joe Velisi. This is a nonfiction anthology of essays where queer and trans writers all choose one horror film to focus on and explore how that film amplified, complicated, or illuminated their own experience of queerness. It's exploring a lot of the thematic parallels that horror media can have with experiences of queerness, while also offering a complex look at how a genre that often comes with so much problematic baggage can inadvertently open itself up to radically subversive readings and take on a completely new meaning despite its original intentions. This is a fascinating collection. I highly recommend it. Reading this was definitely a turning point for me in articulating why horror media often resonates with me and brings a sense of catharsis or satisfaction, despite the fact that it's literally horrific in nature. And it really opened my eyes as to why queer people especially might be drawn to quote-unquote disturbing kinds of stories. Every essay is surprising, thoughtful, deeply personal, and I think every one of them is successful in their own way. After that, we have Heart Haunt Havoc, once again by Friedis Moon. Also talked about this one recently, so again, I'll keep it brief. This is the first book in a trilogy of queer horror romance novellas, and this one is about a trans witch priest named Colin who's called to cleanse an especially unruly haunted house. He's contacted by the handsome non-binary homeowner Bishop Martinez, who seems to keep company with an entire pantheon of ghosts and inhuman creatures, including an especially vengeful wolf-headed spirit. But as Colin digs further into this haunting, it becomes clear that he won't be able to protect Bishop if they don't start sharing their long-kept secrets. This is such a great haunted house story. It delivers on the thrills and chills, the things that go bump in the night. The house in the story is almost like its own character, oscillating between being a space of danger or safety, and it creates this very sinister atmosphere where you never know what's going to happen next. I also just love the concept of sexy witch priests who bastardize religious magic to fight demons. That's very much my brand, and I loved it. I will also just say here that the sequel, Wolf Willow Witch, also fits the bill of queer horror with Norse magic, demonology, and religious occultism. So do with that what you will. Another queer horror story is The Haunting of Alejandra by V. Castro. The main character, Alejandra, is being haunted by La Llorona, the infamous Mexican folk demon. She is grappling with a loss of identity as she deals with a struggling marriage and a daughter that she mostly has to raise on her own, all of which is sending her into a spiral of darkness. In her lowest moments, a ghostly vision often appears to Alejandra of a crying woman in a torn gown who's encouraging her to join its misery by amplifying some of her worst thoughts. These horrific visions cause Alejandra to seek out a therapist and begin exploring her family's history, especially the tumultuous dynamics in the mother-daughter relationships across generations. This is an extremely dark book that explores all the pitfalls of mental illness in a way that pulls no punches. And I appreciate how the underlying fear in the story is the fear of becoming a parent, the fear of trying to protect a child in a cruel world, the fear of failing that child and yourself, and the fear of being boxed into these very narrow ideas of parenthood. There's definitely exploration of how parental roles often play out in Mexican families especially, and the disproportionate amount of work and expectations we often put on the shoulders of mothers. Again, to be transparent, this is not one of my favorite works, but I think it's using horror to have some really interesting and important conversations. So I I think it still definitely deserves to be on this list. Then we have The Scourge Between Stars by Ness Brown. It's a creature feature in space set on a compromised generation ship, and we're following Jacqueline, the daughter of the captain, who's trying to keep the last of humankind alive as they make their way back to Earth after failing to establish a new colony on a distant planet. Their ship is nearly destroyed, they're slowly but surely running out of food and other supplies, and the captain now refuses to leave his quarters. And to make things worse, there is something on board this ship that's picking the crew members off one by one. This novella is so freaking good. Just giving a synopsis brought me back to the story and made me remember how intense and thrilling it was to read this. Like I said, it's a mixture of alien contact and creature feature that's highly suspenseful, gruesome, and violent. It's just such a satisfying story to read. It doesn't overstay its welcome, it's perfectly paced, there's an undeniable sense of urgency that pushes the story forward. It's exactly what it says on the tin, and in my opinion, it does not disappoint. Then, of course, I have to talk about She is a Haunting by Trang Thanh Tran. This is another haunted house story about a bisexual Vietnamese teenager, Jade, who's staying with her estranged father in Vietnam for the summer. Not because she wants to, but because he's agreed to help pay for college if she helps him to restore this French colonial house. But the house has other plans. Not only does Jade wake up paralyzed at night, but she hears the walls humming, there are bugs crawling out of places they shouldn't be, not to mention a ghost bride who cryptically warns Jade time and time again to not eat. This book reaches an absolute fever pitch that I could not have anticipated when I first went into it. I still think about the ending of this book all the time. The breaking point that Jade is forced to reach if she wants to save herself and her family. It's disturbing in some ways, but also powerful. The story is also very openly contending with the legacy of colonization and its resulting trauma, all of which is tied up in the history of this house, and it makes you question what, if anything, about that history is worth preserving in the first place. I would be remiss if I didn't also mention Silver Nitrate by Silvia Moreno Garcia. This is her latest book. It's a historical horror novel featuring the Mexican film industry and occult magic. We're following Montserrat, a talented sound editor, and her best friend Tristan, who was once a fairly popular soap opera star and also Momo's childhood crush. When Tristan discovers that his new neighbor is an infamous cult horror director, both he and Momo start a friendship with this man, and he tells him that he believes his career was cut short because of a curse. Specifically, he was working on a film that he believes was imbued by occult Nazi magic, and for obvious reasons, the film was never finished. Now he wants Momo and Tristan to help him shoot the missing scene and finally lift the curse. Silvia Moreno Garcia can do no wrong in my eyes. She has a brilliant way of calling forth obscure or erased pieces of history and breathing new life into them by way of incredibly original, distinctive explorations of genre, and this story is no exception. It's definitely confronting Mexico's history with white supremacy and how that legacy has long-lasting impacts as characterized by this mysterious curse. The story is also exploring sinister power and magic as well as its equally significant cost. I've also read and enjoyed St. Juniper's Folly by Alex Crespo. This is a YA story that was pitched as Cemetery Boys meets The Haunting of Bly Manor, which actually feels very accurate to me. It's blending elements of paranormal romance with a creepy, abandoned haunted house. We're following three characters in the small town of St. Juniper. Jaime is a foster kid, and when he goes into the woods to escape the small town gossip, he does not come back. Theo is the one who stumbles across this abandoned manor hidden in the woods where he finds Jaime, who physically cannot leave the house. Then Theo goes to get help from Taylor, whose family owns this kitschy little magic shop, but she's secretly a practicing witch. So they're scrambling to find some way to free Jaime before the manor's ghosts can claim him for themselves. As strange as it might sound, this is a creepy but also heartfelt horror story. It does have the dynamic of a goofy, lovable trio getting themselves into a heap of paranormal trouble, but it's also dark and mysterious and sinister with these vengeful ghosts terrorizing Jaime, who literally cannot escape. But I also love the way the story explores the concept of home, especially for a foster kid like Jaime, by way of this creepy haunted house, which in some ways is more consistent than most parts of his life. And it's also asking questions about what it means to be trapped by expectations, by limitations, by grief, versus what it means to be the keepers of our own prisons. It has amateur ghost hunting, curse breaking, occult magic, a really soft queer romance, and overall I enjoyed it very much. We're in the home stretch, I swear, but next is The Bayou by Arden Powell. This story blends together elements of historical fiction, crime fiction, and horror. It's set in Louisiana in 1935 in this town where a young girl once went missing without a trace. Everyone in town assumes that she was killed by gators, but Eugene can't help but think that this girl's death had something to do with a man who used to haunt her, a man that no one else but him could see. Nearly 2 decades later, people are mysteriously disappearing again, and no one can find bodies or evidence of foul play. That's when the charismatic fugitive Johnny Walker arrives in town, tangling himself up in Eugene's life and awakening memories that Eugene thought he had laid to rest. This is another fantastic queer horror novella that's perfect if you're looking for something dark, enticing, and quick to read. As a lover of historical mystery and crime fiction, I found this to be especially satisfying and unexpected in a lot of ways. If you enjoy morally questionable, forbidden queer romance with a dark supernatural twist, I think you also would enjoy this. And it's just cool to see how all the dots are connected by the end and how the villain is perhaps not who you would expect. And again, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention Our Hideous Progeny by C.E. McGill. This is another historical story that blends horror and sci-fi. It's a reimagining, or rather a continuation, of Frankenstein, in which we follow Mary, who's Victor Frankenstein's great niece. She's also a scientist herself, although because of societal convention, she's forced to basically pose as her husband's assistant. They are desperate to break into the scientific community, and when they reach their lowest point, that's when Mary discovers her great-uncle's research and decides to improve upon it with a creature of her own creation. Again, kind of a classic monster story that definitely has like historical Jurassic Park type vibes with the creation of this impossible creature. Much like the original, the story is exploring the question of who is the monster when it comes to this creature and the people who have created it. As a poor, childless, secretly queer woman who finds herself in a quote-unquote man's profession, Mary herself is construed as monstrous and unnatural in a lot of ways. I love how the story explores those thematic parallels between Mary and the creature and the lengths she's willing to go to in order to protect this monster and really protect herself. Penultimately, of course, we have The Spirit Bares Its Teeth once again by Andrew Joseph White. This is Andrew's latest standalone horror novel. It's a historical horror story set in Victorian London following a closeted autistic trans boy named Silas. Silas was born into this underground community of people with violet eyes who can commune with spirits known as speakers and mediums. Because he's seen as a woman, Silas is not allowed to use this magic, but rather is arranged to be married off so that he might procreate and pass on those traits instead. After a desperate attempt to escape this marriage, Silas is diagnosed with a fabricated disease known as veil sickness and forcibly sent to a sanatorium for immediate and aggressive treatment. I did just talk about this one in my August wrap-up, so I won't say too much, but this was incredible. It does not disappoint. This story has all the power and intensity of Hell Followed With Us, but uses very different horror elements to celebrate and center disabled queer rage. It is absolutely railing against systemic ableism and gatekeeping by reveling in this protagonist who is unafraid to meet violence with violence. It's striking, it's gruesome, it's disturbing, but it's also powerful. Lastly, and again, this won't be a surprise if you keep up with my reading or my content, I read I Feed Her to the Beast and the Beast is Me by Jameson Shea. This is a top-notch contemporary horror story about a black bisexual ballerina named Lore who is American by birth but studying ballet in France. For obvious reasons, she stands out among her peers, but not in the way she wants, and she knows that going professional is going to be a huge challenge. So with these important auditions coming up, she goes down to the catacombs and makes a deal with a primordial river of blood, offering her body and her soul in exchange for incredible power and the ability to master the art of dance. But Lore will find out that she is not the only monster around, and her newfound powers might have just made her the perfect target. This is another deeply cathartic story about someone forced into the margins attaining and wielding terrible power, regardless of the cost, and refusing to apologize or make explanations for what they choose to do with that power in moments of desperation, no matter how horrific or selfish. And even though that sounds awful, and it is, it's also powerful, especially when we think about the double-edged sword that is choosing to exist and persist in a world that not only demands but thrives off of our suffering and our complicit silence. Lore refuses to be silent, she refuses to be meek, she refuses to make herself small, even if that makes her the villain, and that's only a small fraction of what makes this story an absolute force to be reckoned with. So once again, to the best of my knowledge, those are all the queer horror books or spooky books that I've read so far, and I would happily recommend any of them. And I'm excited that there's still so much to look forward to in this space. Again, I'm just one imperfect person. Maybe there's something I forgot. I'm very sure there's so many more I haven't read yet or even heard of, so if you know of any other queer horror books that you would recommend, definitely leave them down below in the comments. But that's everything I had to share for today. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, educate yourself, be kind to yourself, take care of yourself, and I will catch you on the flip side of the page.